Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever. Welcome to Off the Shelf Books on Tour. I have a rather unique perspective on today's show. Our author is an author who we interviewed last year with the book Flight of Remembrance, Marina Dutzmann Kirsch, one of the most volume-packed, information-loaded books we've ever reviewed. Couldn't possibly cover it all in one sitting. So we asked her to come back and let us know how the book is received, what the feedback is, and we'll probably cover things that we've never covered before because we only have 28 minutes. Thank you for your return visit.
I'm delighted to be here, Veronica. Thank you.
How has the year been? Well received?
Yes, well received, and I've had quite a number of book events again, as I usually do. I've spoken so far in 7 different states, and a lot of libraries, museums, retirement communities, book clubs, and other venues, churches, quite a lot of churches also. And there has been a lot of interesting feedback. There was one woman that I have not met that gave me a review on Amazon, and she said, "Thank you, Marina, for bringing a bit of my family history home to me." She said, "I never knew that family history because my parents refused to talk about it." They were also from Latvia, as my father was, and she said because they never talked about it, she found out a lot of her family's history and what they might have endured through my story. There was also a man that I did meet at a book presentation, actually the first year my book came out, in April of 2012. His father was killed during World War II as an Allied soldier in Germany, and as a young boy, he was raised to have a sense of animosity toward German people. His mother always told him Germans were evil, they killed his father. But via reading my book and hearing my family's story in the presentation, he said he came to have a whole different attitude toward German people, seeing that they too suffered during the war, and many of them were not Nazis, as my family were not. None of them joined the Nazi Party. Certainly none of them were part of the SS, but they were 2 of my ancestors were forced to serve during the war on the side of Germany, my grandfather and my father.
And we can't possibly synopsis the book for those who didn't see the first interview. It's an amazing story, and I think it's worth reading now with the debate regarding immigrants.
Yes.
What your family brought to America, what your father did with Saturn V, Apollo, working for Chrysler, and consulting for NASA. Those are all gifts that he brought with him after teaching children as well, and gratefully gifted to America. And I think that's important to know with this debate going on regarding immigration. I mean, how many members of your family actually became American citizens and settled here?
Everyone except for my father's mother. And she also never learned English. She always said, "Oh, I'm so bad at languages." So she spoke only German. And as a result, the gift that came out of that, though, was that we children learned to speak German. We maintained German. As long as Grandma was alive, that was the only way we could communicate with her, although she was sly. I think she understood a bit more than she let on to, but we really rarely heard her speak a word of English. I might mention, too, that my grandfather, as well as my father, both worked in the U.S. aerospace industry, and Grandpa worked long beyond retirement age. He didn't retire until he was 72 years old, and he worked with gyroscopes, which were the directional systems in the rockets. But Dad was head of a team of people that designed components of the Saturn 1B rocket, and all of those were later used successfully in the Apollo moon missions.
Did he not have a relationship with Christopher McAuliffe as well? Did he not work on that particular rocket system?
No, by that time, when Krista McAuliffe so unfortunately died, Dad was already retired. And from retirement on, which was 1982, he devoted himself to sharing his skills, his expertise, and his enthusiasm with people all over the Lakes region, particularly children. So he worked in a lot of the schools, doing workshops with kids and leading programs like Young Astronauts. The chapter that he started at the Alton School in the Lakes region was the premier chapter in the entire state. And he also wrote an article on every NASA mission for about 33 years for a magazine called Flugrevue. That's a German magazine, but it was also published in French and in English. So every U.S. space mission was covered by my dad in that magazine. He was quite devoted to that field from a young age. I mean, aeronautical engineering originally.
Both he and your father seem to have been born with the gene.
Yes, both he and my grandfather, yes, absolutely.
Wanting to know more, explore more, get closer to God, maybe.
Yeah, well, my grandfather was actually an electrical engineer, and Dad was originally an aeronautical engineer, but born at just the right time that he would be inspired by early attempts at flight, and then it was the right timing that the aerospace industry was just emerging. And so Dad managed to not only not have his career be totally derailed by war, but that he could also funnel his creativity and his dedication to the field into the aerospace industry. It was really quite an amazing sequence of events that led to that.
But they seem to have had such a unique spirit in mind. To go back to one of the camps that they were in, where people were doing with whatever they could do. And he took the packing crates and made a cottage.
Oh, yes.
With a front porch.
That was my grandfather. One huge crate that was originally, it held some kind of vehicles, military vehicles or something, wooden crate. He built a little tiny cottage, so small that in the so-called living room, there were benches built into the walls. There was no room for furniture. And they were also used as beds for people to sleep on. Then with the next crate he obtained, he built a little porch onto the front. And it's actually a delightful little cottage, which I'll have to make sure I get you a photograph to show.
Oh, it's on the DVD, when I revisited the program that we did last year. Or it's on your webpage. The information on your webpage is astounding. Having read the book, having met you and interviewed you, I was still surprised, informed, and appreciative of the knowledge in its Kirshner books, Kirschstone books, webpage. When you went back to one of the camps that they had been in, when you donated documents to the museum, I mean, that was astounding information. So anybody who has read the book should also visit the Kirschstone books webpage. It was astounding.
And I also offer a 40-page free excerpt from the About the Book page on my website.
You mean I could have cheated without reading the whole thing?
You could have cheated for the first 40 pages. No. But however, the most dramatic part of the story you would have definitely missed. And incidentally, that's part of the story I do not tell in any of my book presentations. I actually found people like to have me relate the story, so I do. But I leave out that part because it's climactic, it's dramatic, and it's almost unbelievable how my parents discovered that each one of them was alive and how they were finally reunited after the war. So I like to let people read that in the book. It's almost too synchronistic to be true, but it actually is true.
The way that they kept track of one another, how they provided an escape mechanism to freedom. You being born in Switzerland, interrupt us.
Thank God, a neutral country.
Right.
I'm so grateful
So
for
do
that.
you maintain, you don't have dual citizenship, or do you?
I don't. And actually, my choices were not Swiss and American. My choices were German and American.
That's what I would have thought.
And of course, as an 8-year-old at the time, I was bound and determined to do whatever my family was going to do. So I became an American citizen and have not experienced any regret at that whatsoever. My family, I might add, my parents were so grateful to be here in the USA and for the wonderful new life, which was a dream come true for both of them and for my grandparents as well. Actually, everyone in the family immigrated except for my mother's father. My mother's father was trapped in the eastern part of Germany, and my mother never saw him again, or her stepmother, or her stepsisters. But a wonderful sequel to that story is that even today, my mother at 94 is in touch with her oldest stepsister via email. So they've been reunited partly as a result of the book. We've also been reunited with some other missing parts of our family from Latvia who got a hold of my book via Amazon, realized that they're related to us, and we are now in touch via email as well.
Now that's wicked cool.
It is wicked cool.
And I think the internet, of all the awful things it does, it also does some very positive things.
It does some very positive things.
In that it does connect and give to you gifts that you never expected, nor did the people who have found you. And I think it also gives hope to people who are searching, who never knew, who didn't know it was possible to ever find out and reunite emotionally as well as physically with family that up until that point in time when you push that funny little button are lost to you.
Well, the other thing that I've found from my presentations and from people who read the book is the healing potential of a story from the other side. A lot of people don't consider whether stories from the other side are valuable, especially if the other side was led by an evil regime, as in this case. And the little emblem at the top over the title of my book is actually a pre-World War II Latvian glider.
That's what I got.
That was built by my father and a group of young men in Latvia. My father actually is flying it. I was forced, however, to do an illustration of it. I am a graphic designer by profession. I do a lot of book design these days, in fact. And that little glider means two things to me. It represents my father's overriding passion in life for the field of aeronautical engineering, but also it represents my own quest to gain a higher perspective on World War II via my family's story. The researching, the writing. I feel like I lived and breathed my family's story through the retelling, the writing, and now presenting to other people.
What do you think is most valuable, the oral histories that you've heard or the written history that you've found?
Well, the wonderful thing was, and I would never have written this book without it, the family history that my parents wrote in the late 80s, early 90s, entitled Traces in History, A Family Story. Now, they only wrote that for family. And my mother typed all the pages. She didn't type like this, like I do. She typed with all fingers on an old-fashioned typewriter where one key always stuck, and she had to type it twice.
Well, that's where we have the one-upsmanship on the newer generation that hunt and peck. We at least know where the keys are.
So they had these pages copied. They had them bound into a beautiful hardbound cover. 237 pages, including some photographs, which were not the greatest resolution in that book, but they told the story. And that to me was the most valuable, because even though I had heard a lot of the stories orally growing up, my family never, my parents, my grandparents too, other than my grandfather who never talked about it, but my grandmothers talked about the war sometimes, and my parents talked about it quite a bit, and also their growing up years. But when I finally had that book of theirs in my hands, I got the full dramatic sweep of their story. And I thought, wow, please copyright this right away, which they did at my request. But it took me another 13 years before I knew what to do with it.
What a gift.
My first vision was a film. But then after writing a movie treatment that was well received, I knew a book should be the next step.
More personal, more interactive.
And that way I could gauge the amount of interest, and I could gauge really how critical and how important this story might be in the scheme of things to bring a new perspective onto World War II Germany to a lot of people.
Did you ever publish it?
The movie treatment?
Their book.
Oh, their book? No, their book remains in the hands of family members only. All of their children and grandchildren, I have 2 brothers, we each received a copy of the book, and all of their grandchildren who were already born before 1993 received a copy. There were no great-grandchildren yet at that time.
No, that's the book
So
that I
there
would
are
like to see every
probably
family have.
13, 14 copies in existence.
Well, if ever you want to come back, you bring that one with you.
I should have remembered to bring it today,
Oh, I'd love to
along
read
with
that.
a couple of newspaper articles that feature, one of them features my dad. It's entitled, For German Soldier, A Long, Strange Road to Freedom. And it features this same photograph of my father in sepia tone on page 1 of the Concord Sunday Monitor. And that story maybe influenced me more than any other. That was from about 2003. And it told the story about how they reunited at the end of the war, how dramatic, how emotional that time was. And at that point I already knew, okay, imminent, that I'm going to do something with this story. And in 2004 I did the movie treatment, but it wasn't until 2009 that I started writing the book.
We'll be back in a moment while Marina prepares to read us one of her favorite passages.
The segment I'm going to read is from the story right after my grandmother's and my mother's home in Berlin is partially destroyed by an Allied bombing raid. Now, their home was destroyed floor by floor. They lived in a high-rise apartment building. One floor after another was destroyed. This particular bombing raid was the worst one they had experienced to date. They emerged dazed and shaken from the basement to find the walls of their apartment had partially collapsed. The windows were all shattered, including the large floor-to-ceiling window in the living room. What was left of the back-out blinds hung in dreary tatters across the gaping holes where glass had once been. Heaps of plaster, broken glass and debris were everywhere, and settling over everything was a layer of thick dust that penetrated even into cupboards and closets, into their food supply, and into their eyes, noses, and mouths. Lilo choked on the dust that hung suspended in the air like a deadly shroud. Outside the broken windows, they saw the jagged remains of destroyed buildings, eerily illuminated against the night sky by the flames of other burning buildings behind them. The night resounded with frantic raised voices, shouting, wailing, and moaning, with the sounds of running footsteps both inside the building and out in the street. Lilo tried to take it all in, then collapsed into a dust-covered chair, laughing hysterically as she realized how close they had come to annihilation. Jumping back up, she exclaimed to Gertrude, "We are alive!" They hugged each other in relief bordering on delirium, feeling as though they had personally achieved a major victory. Lilo, famished, found a crust of bread in a cupboard and devoured it, dust and all, wondering whether others also experienced the same kind of post-air raid hunger pangs. After a silence while they took stock of their situation, grimly surveying the devastation, Gertrude remarked in a matter-of-fact tone, "Tomorrow we replace the windows."
No, I liked her. She's my kind of woman. There was nothing that she couldn't do.
My grandmother Gertrude was a mover and a shaker. Both of my grandmothers were truly very interesting and amazing women. Gertrude was very adventurous, bold. She would take action. And let's remember that this story takes place during wartime. And during wartime, women are forced to take on the roles that normally would be the prerogative of men. And that was certainly the case for both of my grandmothers and also for my mother and my Aunt Ruth. They had to do what they had to do, and they did not have the men around to tell them what to do.
But in some instances, their thought process was better than the guys, and better than the soldiers, and better than the guys. Look at what they pulled off in their coming and going and getting and delivering and finding. And I'm sure they had disappointments, and I'm sure it didn't all work. But they were smart cookies.
Well, I think in any society, and that probably includes the societies today in the Middle East, it is the heart of the women that truly brings home the heart of that culture. And it was the same with the women in Germany. And I think if women had been ruling the country, that war might have never taken place. It might have been a very different world at the time and also today.
You think? Sort of like a beehive where the queen's in charge and everybody else is female except for the drones who sit around and drink beer and eat pretzels all day. Get thrown out once a year, and the survival is the colony, the people.
Yes.
And how to benefit and continue on.
Think about the children, think about the future. Think about preserving resources. Think about Mother Earth and all that it means to us.
I have a dear friend who's German who grew up at that time, and I admire her more than anyone I've ever met in my life. Broke me into a million pieces and built me back up at 21. And I owe my life success to her training, dogma. She's just unbelievable. And it almost like the German language, learning it in your home. When you learn that Cinderella doesn't live here, that everything isn't delivered on a platter and you have to work for what you want. These people in these stories that go on and on and on are a perfect example of where we have to reinvent ourselves as Americans.
Yes, and also, I have to say about the women, they are the bearers of the culture, the bearers of the children, and they also are the bearers, in many cases, of a strong faith and a sense of optimism that no matter what happens, they're ready to pick up the pieces again. They're ready, like my grandmother, to take that next step, to replace the windows. Well, that apartment didn't last much longer. Those windows were blown out again. Then they gave up on that, but they boarded them up with plywood, with old carpets, with anything they could tack up against the cold and the wet and whatever, until they finally were able to move out of Berlin. But that was a tough thing to achieve.
And they went on to produce an author who tells an exceptionally good story. Thank you for bringing the story back to us.
Thank you, Veronica.
That's it for Off the Shelf Books on Tour today. Bye.